Thanks to the organizers for putting this on. Thanks also to the people who administer and manage this space for hosting us. It sounds like you've maybe done this before in this space. But good on you not getting it cancelled. There's this group called UK Lawyers for Israel that's basically kind of on the watch for events like this happening across the country and sending these very threatening letters to venues, especially publicly funded venues, and trying to get events like this cancelled with threats of burying venue administrators with paperwork. Which was the case with the venue in Bath last night, but the Bath library effectively said, no, we're not cancelling. Do your worst. Which is also a testament to kind of when you have sustained organizing in a place like this or in Bath or elsewhere, as you do with so many events coming up and having just passed and so on, those relationships, which become friendships and become social bonds, are ultimately a big part of what gives us power as a movement. I was asked to speak in Abergavenny and Bath and Frome this week, and to try to, I think that the brief was something like, we'd like to have a conversation with our members to think about the road ahead, and maybe share some thoughts on that. And that gave me an opportunity to kind of think about what I had learned and what I have learned in the last 6 months, and to try to share some of that with you. So I've been an educator on Palestine for over 25 years now. People say I don't look it, but I often end up kind of like repeating things and giving very similar kinds of talks and sharing similar kinds of information in a kind of Palestine 101 type of framing, and oftentimes people ask me to speak on particular things. But I think, as you all know, these last 6 months have felt somewhat different. There's something before October is not the same as after October. And I tried to just reflect on what it is that felt different and what for me was even kind of different. And I realized that actually a lot of it isn't that it's different, it's that I hadn't allowed, and I think a lot of Palestinians hadn't allowed, and a lot of people who've been working on this hadn't allowed, to really sink in just how deeply some of these kind of points I want to share with you are. So I want to share them with you. And so they're all things that we kind of know, but then it's sort of different when you really let it sink in. The first of these is that Zionism is a form of supremacist and fascist thought and politics. I think, it can be a little bit common to say, oh, that's fascist or that's fascism or whatnot, and to not really be very accurate with our use of language. But I can't think of a definition of fascism to which Zionism wouldn't fit. My understanding of fascism is a kind of highly centralized, highly militarized political ideology in which you have a sort of definition of us and them, and you try to police that us and them with the use of brutal force, often with a kind of ideology that talks about the purity of us. And the impurities that they create by being amongst us. And I think what I hadn't really reckoned with before is the way that Zionist fascism has been a genocidal ideology alone. I actually was one of the people who, in the early 2000s, very much resisted and argued against the Palestine movement using the term genocide to talk about what we were experiencing. One, I didn't think that, apartheid isn't particularly gentle. It's not like, it's just an apartheid state is somehow like letting them off the hook. Apartheid is brutal. And it was a very clear-cut case of Israel committing the crime of apartheid since 1947 until today. Or the Zionist movement from 1947, Israel from May 1948. And I think the reason for my resistance to that was that Zionism was never really about, or the way that Zionism unfolded upon Palestinians and the land of Palestine never really seemed to be about mass murder and mass slaughter, right? When we think about genocide, genocide is about mass murder and with the goal of extinguishing and exterminating a group or groups. And I think also we had become accustomed to the language, partly in thanks to Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, of thinking about this as ethnic cleansing. Even though we knew that ethnic cleansing is not a crime under international law. Actually, ethnic cleansing becomes a term after the Yugoslavia war, and particularly in order not to invoke the term genocide. So it was very clearly aspects of genocide in Yugoslavia, but to call it genocide, for the international community to recognize it as genocide, would have created obligations and duties on all the member states of the international community to act in a certain way. And they did not want to invoke that, and they did not want to create that duty and that obligation upon themselves. And so they created this non-crime, this category of ethnic cleansing. In the case of Palestine, the way that the Zionist movement has, as you all know, behaved and acted upon Palestine and Palestinians has involved a great deal of murder. But it's always been about forced expulsion. It's always been about land expropriation and expelling the people. It's always been about maximum land under exclusive Zionist control with the minimum number of Palestinians on that land, which is also translated into the largest number of Palestinians able to remain in Palestine, squeezed into the smallest ghettos and open-air prisons possible. And I think because of that, it just didn't feel like a very clear-cut case of genocide. And I think what I've now understood is that even before October, yes, it has always been a genocidal ideology, and it has always been a genocidal practice. It's just that it's been genocide by detail. It's been kind of this genocidal ideology and body of practice and military practice that works kind of in large intensity over a short period of time and then kind of relaxes for a moment. Steal a few kilometers squared and then relax for a minute. Kill villagers in one place and then kind of move on to another place. And so it never really felt like this kind of campaign to extinguish us all. But from the very founding moment of the Zionist movement in the 1880s and 1890s, the ideology was always to create a pure state, right, where there's exclusive Jewish presence in the state, but where the majority of the people on that land were not Jewish by the definition of the Zionist movement. And so it's always been about eliminating Palestinian presence in Palestine. It's just the fact that it was kind of done by detail, done over the course of decades rather than with the intensity of months that made us kind of resistant to the notion of thinking about this as genocidal, as a genocidal movement and a genocidal ideology. And yet it is. And since October, that's become abundantly clear. Right? There's no denying it anymore, because now it even fits our idea of what genocide would look like, which is mass slaughter, which is extinguishing, exterminating, eliminating a particular group because of their identity. And in the most brutal of ways that I don't really need to go into because you're all very much aware of what the last 6 months have looked like. The second thing that I knew but hadn't really sunk in quite deep enough is that with supremacist and fascist ideologies and movements, there can be no negotiating. There can be no reforming fascism. And I think the importance of that lesson is, I still feel that we still kind of behave to, not we, but many people continue to act, political organizers, activists and so on, as if somehow we're going to convince Israel to be less racist. Somehow convince the Zionist movement not to be a genocidal and apartheid movement. And that's, I think, if we thought that before October, I think we can never think that again. There's no situation where we lobby the state of Israel into becoming not a genocidal project if it's going to uphold Zionism as its core ideology. because it is a fascist, supremacist movement. It is a movement that sees us as people that cannot be there, that need to be extinguished and eliminated. And so reforming that has always been effectively a matter of slowing things down or changing the sort of character of the mass extinguishing of the Palestinian people. But that's not reform. That's simply just kind of slowing it down, changing the terms, changing some of the topography, and just delaying, kicking the can down the path. And that's effectively what's been done, right? Is that the resistance over the course of the past 75 years has managed to maybe save some land here while other land gets taken there, release some prisoners here while they arrest exactly the same number of prisoners there, and so on and so forth. And this kind of nickel and diming does not and will not ever result in the end of this apartheid genocide project of Zionism. It must be crushed. It must be defeated. It must be ended. Otherwise, we are the ones who are ended. And it's not just us Palestinians, as I'm going to talk about later. And based on that also, or kind of following from that, an understanding of where states like the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, most of the other European countries and so on, Azerbaijan, India, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, the allies of the Zionist project around the world, which is most of the states in the state system in one way or another, I think we've tended to treat their relationship to Israel as a relationship of alliance. And so our activism in a place like Britain becomes the activist, at least that activism that's directed towards the British state, has been about downgrading the place of Israel from an ally to maybe a lesser ally. And I think what we've missed, and what I've begun to understand a lot more clearly in the last 6 months, is that these aren't just regular allies. When they talk about themselves, they talk about Israel as a special relationship. Right? When we talk here in the United States, ever since the 1970s, the US talks about Israel as, the relationship with Israel as a special relationship. And we begin to hear that language in British politics as well, definitely in Australia and other places. And I think what we're really dealing with here is a kind of unity. It's not that Britain exists here and Israel exists here in the eyes of British policymakers and leaders and corporate executives and so on. It's not that Israel is over there and it's somehow our friend and we're now negotiating the terms of that friendship. They see themselves as one. It's a kind of kindred fascism. Right? It's a oneness. And as I've been giving these talks, actually, I've begun to sort of think of the metaphor to understand this as a kind of house of cards. They see Israel as this kind of very important card in this card pyramid. And that if Israel falls, if the Zionist project falls, there's a chance that the entire edifice collapses. But what is this edifice? Right? What is this oneness? And it's really based on things like allowing for a status quo or a situation considered normal, where the very tiny minority get to enrich themselves at the expense of the vast majority, who are immiserated in the process. Right? And we're really seeing that in Britain. I've seen that in my 8-9 years here. I've really seen that accelerate. I'll talk about that a bit more later. But I think we're seeing it in the United States, we're seeing it in Australia, we're seeing it in India, we're seeing it in Azerbaijan, we're seeing it in many different places, Brazil under Bolsonaro, the Philippines, and so on, is effectively the normalization of fascism as the normal way politics are conducted. And though there is opposition, and though there is sort of occasional outrage when the bloodshed is too much, or the crackdown is too much, or the violence is too much, we've slowly, but actually quite quickly, become quite accustomed to thinking of this or treating it as if it's normal. Treating our own outrage like it's normal as well. It's like, okay, I'm outraged. That's the new normal. I think the pandemic years were really kind of exceptional for this as well. Right? States got away with murder, literally. Right? It was effectively a genocide of the elderly, globally. An aspect of the pandemic. But the policies and in which we were told to go and kind of clap for the NHS as they were gutting it, right? As our health workers were putting their bodies on the line and their health on the line, as the state here and elsewhere was gutting the NHS. and treating that as like, oh, that's unfortunate, but we carry on, right? Keep calm and carry on. And so this kindred, so I think, of course, lobbying and work on government is important, and holding representatives to account is important. But I think as we do this work, we need to recognize that this isn't about convincing them to downgrade an ally to something more conditional or something somehow lesser. But that what we're actually trying to do is, what we're actually up against is people who see themselves as one, as a unit, as a kindred, as family, as the same house of cards, that if we let the Zionist project fall, then what becomes of us as the British elite, or the American ruling class, or the Canadian ruling class, or so on, right? In the case of the settler colonies like Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, there's an added element here, which is, in what world do we expect the United States or Canada or Australia to say that what Israel is doing is wrong? Right? These countries are also committing an ongoing genocide against their own indigenous populations. They all learned from each other constantly for the past several centuries. The kind of geography, the spatial logic of Israeli apartheid, which all of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with, our Bantustans, were very much modeled on the South African experience, the South African apartheid regime's spatial policies, down to almost a percentage, right? 87% of the land of South Africa was reserved for the white population. It's about 87% of the land of Palestine that's reserved for exclusively Jewish population. But that's just a coincidence. The real issue here is that they studied each other. The South Africa model was actually based on Canada. The way that they designed the spatiality of the Bantustans and homelands was based on Canada's genocide and the reservation system in Canada, where I lived for 10 years and I'm very much familiar with the reservation system. Similarly, that system of finding an indigenous elite that will be the first line of defense, the policeman for the apartheid project, which in Canada is called the band councils. In South Africa, it was called the Bantustan administrations, and in Palestine, it's called the Palestinian Authority. These are all modeled on one another as well, right? And it's actually draws from an older British tradition that was developed in West Africa that was called indirect rule, and most famously kind of written about by a guy called Lord Lugard. This kindred fascism is a form of internationalism, right? It's a fascist internationalism, and that's what we're up against. And this is what I'm saying is that we need to approach any kind of work that's directed at government with an understanding that no, you're not going to convince a representative to kind of switch sides. They may give you some nice words, but they understand who they're accountable to on the government side of things, right? If we think about the degree of sustained mobilization over the last 6 months around this issue, you know, we all grew up thinking that the way that liberal democracy works is that there is supposed to be a responsiveness from political representatives, and that the voice of the people and the threat of the elections, whatever it is that we are kind of taught or kind of raised to believe about this mythology of liberal democracy. You know, it's unthinkable that you have a 6-month-long sustained actions in almost every village and hamlet and town and city across a country. This is, by the way, quite literally one of the high points of British anti-fascism. And I don't think we're talking about this as much, but the last 6 months are a moment that future historians need to write about as one of the high points of the anti-fascist movement in this country. Right? But a sustained 6 months and counting, right? And events every other day in a town like Froome, and this is just one corner of the country. And it's the same all across the country, as all of you know, with zero responsibilities, right? With practically no member of this one-party state that's pretending to be a two-party state. Because what's the difference between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak? Starmer got elected. That's the difference, I think. The zero responsiveness, right? This is not how the system is supposed to work. There's supposed to be a third estate, or whatever called the media, that's supposed to hold them accountable. It's been dismal, right? There's been this war on grammar and syntax. Head crashes into bullet. This system that we think we live in is not the system we live in. And part of that is because we really are moving towards, and have moved to, and are in, and have been in for years. And Gaza has shown us this now. The masks are all off now. We are living in a fascist country. The carceral system, the policing system, these are all arms of this. But we still pay lip service to the language of liberal democracy, even though that liberal democracy itself, its logical conclusion, if we really think about it, this is something Aimé Césaire told us about in the 60s already, right? The logical conclusion, he's talking about Nazism in Germany, and he's saying Nazism is the logical conclusion of capitalist liberal democracy. Right? As soon as it faces real crisis, real threat, it closes its ranks, and all of the violence it's used to committing against the people out in the colonies turns to the people locally. It's built into capitalist liberal democracy that at that last moment where the system feels like it's facing a real crisis and a threat, Nazism and fascism is what we're going to get. And that's exactly what we're seeing in all of these countries right now. And the sooner we realize that and realize that this is what we're contending with, the sooner we're able to focus our actions and our strategies and our tactics accordingly. But what I'm actually saying also is that, like, what we're seeing in Gaza is not something that's happening over there by this other kind of rogue regime. Gaza is just, this actually in a way is the Spanish Revolution and Spanish Civil War again. Gaza is the place where Palestinians are saying they shall not pass, no pasarán. They passed, the fascists passed in Spain. We let them pass, right? And we ended up with Hitler. In Palestine right now, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and 48 Palestine are trying to say no pasarán, are trying to say they shall not pass. And if we let them pass, we're next. Because if we allow this, and not because, and by allow, I don't mean like we're sitting at home. All of you are engaging in all kinds of action to try to stop this. But if we don't focus our actions with the urgency of really needing to stop this, then this becomes normalized. I studied international law for a while. I got very disillusioned. I thought I was going to be an immigration lawyer, but then I worked at a legal clinic, and everybody who I defended, it was basically a coin toss whether they got deported or not. And I thought maybe I'd do Aboriginal law. This was in Canada. And all the cases I was studying would take 15 to 20 years, and then they'd get a few meters squared of their land back and call it a day. So I was completely disillusioned and I left the legal route. But I studied enough international law to understand that international law is largely based on something called customary international law. And customary international law can be summarized as what have states gotten away with in the past. Effectively, if a state gets away with something, the next state that wants to do that same thing can say, this is actually has foundation as possibly legal because that other state got away with it. And in many ways, at least on the legal front, Israel plays the role of that kid that tries the unthinkable and sees if they can get away with it so that the other siblings can then come in and get away with it. Right? And that's been the case. This is not new. I kind of was alerted to it about 12 years ago or 10 years ago on a BBC show called Hard Talk with Tim Sebastian. It was still Tim Sebastian who was hosting it. And he had the Polish foreign minister in the interviewee chair. And he said, hey, why is, and he was going to ask one of the hard questions. He said, why is the Polish immigrant refugee system one of the most draconian in the world? And the Polish foreign minister said, we based it on the Israeli law. And Tim Sebastian, of course, said, oh, well, in that case, next question. Because I'm not going to touch that one. So the impunity that Israel has been given has allowed it and enabled it to take up that space where it's the one that's able to test the boundaries. And right now, the boundaries that it's testing are beyond grotesque, because those are the boundaries of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, the laws that are meant to ensure that war is something that only combatants really deal with, and that civilians are protected. But Israel is very clearly, directly, systematically, institutionally, explicitly, avowedly, directing its assaults on the civilian population and the infrastructure that allows for civilian life to continue. And what I'm saying is, when the United States or Britain or Australia want to go to war next time and want to bomb a mosque or a church or a hospital or a water treatment facility or anything that enables life for civilian life, then when someone comes and says, hey, you're not allowed to do that under the Geneva Convention, there is a very strong possibility that the response will be, yeah, but Israel got away with it in Gaza. Why are you being a hypocrite and saying I can't do it? And that really is how international law works. That is what customary international law is. And that is terrifying, to say the least. And it's not just the laws of war. Israel has been basically pushing away everything on the international legal level that creates protection, but then also passing laws and pursuing policies and actions and practices domestically within Palestine that are now also, would have been ghastly done in the past and are now being adopted by others. So for example, Israeli administrative detention in the Second Intifada, so 20 plus years ago, we had like several hundred administrative detainees. Administrative detention, as some of you know, is the incarceration of a person without telling them what they're being charged with or any of the evidence themselves or their lawyer, what they're being charged with, what the evidence is against them, and can be renewed. In Palestine, it's mostly done as 6 months blocks. So you're there for 6 months, and then they just kind of sign a little document, and you're there for another 6 months. You have no idea why you're there. This is happening now in Britain. We now have the equivalent of administrative detention here in the UK. Right? And it's effectively being tested out on the most vulnerable population, mostly Muslim immigrants and refugees. But then once it starts to expand, because that's how they do it, right? It's just like, oh, we got away with it this time. Let's see who else we can do it with. It's the same with arming police. Right? The whole idea of we don't arm the police in Britain, we're not barbarians like those Americans. And then slowly, just in the years I've been here, I've seen more and more guns in the hands of police officers. Of course, I think the unit that may have been the trailblazer in this is this terrestrial, what are they called? Territorial Protection Unit, something like this. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? This is a unit that was actually formed by the person who was the head of the Ulster police force and then became the head of the Met. And he had served in Palestine for years. He made his career in Palestine, in the British occupation of Palestine. Came back home to Britain and was stuck on the Irish, and then became the head of the London Met. And in the early 80s, and effectively was the main philosopher behind what was called Ulsterization, so making policing the core of the British occupation in Northern Ireland, and then became the head of the London Police, and brought in this Territorial Protection Unit, or whatever it's called, which became then the prime anti-terrorism part of the London Met in the early 2000s until today. And they're armed to the teeth. This is the learning that happens. This is these technologies of power and devastation and control that move from one place to another. And I think the other lesson here that I felt I've learned in the last 6 months is we really can't rely on the institutions of liberal values. I think there's two parts to this. One is these things about kind of representative government, the media being this sort of third estate or fourth estate that can hold the others to account, the fact that the judiciary is going to be independent and hold the other branches to account, and so on. We've seen that all fail. in the last 6 months. That's one side of it. But then there's this other side of it, which is Aimé Césaire's point about fascism being the logical kind of fallback option for these regimes when they face crisis. And then there's something built into liberal democracy that doesn't get talked about by John Locke or other philosophers of liberal democracy, which is that really it's popular movements that hold governments to account. And we think of that in terms of things like the trade union movement. But then where has the trade union movement been? Right. I've been to many of the London demos, and many of the big trade unions, including my own, send a number 2 or a number 1 or a number 3 to come and give a rousing speech. And you think that that union is going to go on strike the next day from the heat of the speech. You think, oh wow, PCS is really going to just shut it down for Palestine. But then you go on their websites and look at their press releases, you go on their social media, you look at what it is that they've actually been doing, and it's tumbleweeds. It's nothing. They're very happy to show up to the demo where everybody supports this and gain the popularity that might come from those listening in the crowd, because there's hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. But then where is this union? I'm trying to lobby my union to do anything. Not even my local branch can do it. Let alone the national leadership, taking any kind of leadership to do anything to stop this genocide. Imagine if the unions called a general strike in November. They could have stopped this genocide. Just the British unions alone, probably, could have put a serious dent and made a very serious contribution to ending the mass slaughter. But nothing. And still today, 6 months into it, nothing. This system doesn't work. And especially in times of crisis, it turns into what it's supposed to exactly be the antithesis of, which is that notion of tyranny. It turns into tyranny. And so, my kind of the real message I want to bring to you, and those of you who have been to Palestine probably heard this even before October, when you asked, what is it that you want us to do? And many Palestinians probably told you, we want you to go and kind of retake your countries. Go and fight the fascism in your countries. Israel cannot sustain itself without the impunity it's given and the support it's given by your countries. So please change that. And I think now it's not even about Palestine anymore. Palestine is there to remove the masks and give us a very naked and real and raw feeling about what it is that we're actually facing in our own countries. And I think what we've learned from Gaza, what Gaza is teaching us in this no pasarán moment, in this they shall not pass moment, is we need to retake our societies. We need to retake our countries. That's what's going to change anything, is to find the ways where we're able to actually be autonomous and be heard, and have, when you have millions of people in the street, or not in the street, wanting the same thing, that is the basis for the kinds of policies that are in place. Where things like the trade union movement and the NH and the healthcare system and the media are working as they're supposed to be, because we are in control of them, locally, regionally, nationally. I also want to just kind of, because we are when we are, April 17th is in a few days, that's Palestinian Prisoners' Day. I just want to kind of highlight the Palestinian Prisoners movement, because I think it's essential. Some of you probably know that last week, one of the most important leaders of the Palestine Prisoners movement, Walid Daqa, was martyred as a result of medical negligence by the Israelis. They're still holding on to his body, and will be for months to come, at least. This is the man who had been held, and now his body continues to be, since 1986. He's the 6th longest serving Palestinian political prisoner. And a leading intellectual of the Palestinian prisoners movement. He's a Palestinian from 48 Palestine, so he was a Palestinian citizen of the state of Israel. I also want to just highlight that just today we got news that a 57-year-old man called Abdurrahim Amir was killed in prison. And he was only arrested last month, 57 years old. Him and his son were arrested because they crossed from their city, Qalqiya. They crossed the Green Line to look for work. They were captured and charged with crossing into Israel illegally. And now he's dead. And another Palestinian citizen of Israel, Yaqub Touhi, was killed by a cop 2 days ago because of a parking dispute. An Israeli cop got angry with him over a parking issue and just shot him point blank in the middle of the street in Yemen. This isn't just about Gaza. Some of you are probably also following the East Ramallah villages that are being raided. Like the videos look like medieval-style raids of these vigilante settlers armed to the teeth, shooting at regular people's homes, with children trying to hide behind the walls, and adults getting on the roofs and trying to fight these assault rifles with rocks. All the cars and homes being burned. Right? This isn't about just the Israeli military. Indeed, the military-civilian distinction for Israeli society is tenuous at best. This is, right, there's kind of the head of the Italian Communist Party after Antonio Gramsci was imprisoned, wrote a book about fascism, reflecting on Italian fascism, and he said what makes fascism different from kind of non-fascism is that it's a mass movement. It's popular. They win elections. Fascists win elections. Trump won his election. Bolsonaro wins his election. Rishi Sunak was not going to win any elections, but Boris Johnson did. This pits society against itself, and that's important to know. And this is about putting our bodies on the line. Right? This is about becoming dangerous, becoming threatening. If it's gentle, if it's parades from A to B where we all go home feeling good, we haven't actually threatened anything, right? If we're asking the police for permission and they give it to us, and then they give us the route that we're going to walk on, we're not threatening anything. What differentiates that from a parade? The slogans? Barely. Yeah. So that's what I leave you with. In terms of Palestinians, our grandparents' generation fought not to be expelled. They lost. Our parents' generation fought to liberate Palestine. They were defeated. Our generation is now fighting for our liberation in return. We might win. We might defeat Zionism. But if we're not, our children will. They can't kill us all. They committed one of their biggest mistakes when they expelled 70% of us out, because we're out here. They can try to find us. They can try to hunt us down. They can stop us from speaking. They can arrest us in Milan in Berlin. They can do all of these kinds of things. They can cancel venue bookings, and they can call us anti-Semites, and they can have their Canary Mission websites, and go ahead. That's what we expect them to do. That's what fascists do. What anti-fascists do is fight that. And we're going to continue to fight that. That's not going to stop. The question is, where are you going to be? What are you going to be up to? What are you going to do?